don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Lauren Brown, Jonathan Dallimore, and Aaron Aastor. Lauren is a history educator and writer with years of experience in K-12 and teacher preparation. Jonathan currently works with the History Teachers Association of New South Wales and Australia, and is an author who joined me in February of this year on this podcast to talk about his latest book, Teaching History, a practical guide for secondary school teachers, which we'll link to in the show notes, of course. And Aaron is a college history professor in Tennessee and also has some experience in the advanced placement world. This conversation came about after I had a few online interactions with Lauren, and while I don't really recall the exact content of those interactions, I think they were regarding some distinctions about things like the role of knowledge and memorization as they relate to learning and critical thinking. As a result of that, I invited her to connect on a call to discuss more deeply, and we had a really good dialectic conversation that surfaced some agreements and some interesting disagreements. We wished we had recorded it, but decided that inviting a couple of other voices to this salon conversation instead of attempting to replicate it as a podcast seemed like a better idea, and Jonathan and Aaron were kind enough to join us here. Our conversation started with the problem of insufficient knowledge for and with college students, as Aaron identified in a somewhat viral tweet. From there, we examined the crucial balance between teaching fundamental facts, the role of explicit instruction and inquiry, and other important instructional moves in the teaching of history, and making connections to understand the world around us. I really enjoyed this conversation, and while they can be logistically difficult to arrange, it's these kinds of dialectic exchanges where we're not arguing to win or to persuade, but to illuminate beliefs and truth that I find truly rewarding. On that note, it's seemingly increasingly true that many of my interactions on social media that do go poorly, which aren't most of them by any stretch, may be in large part due to a difference in the mode of engagement. And it seems like most of those interlocutors are looking for or maybe expecting something like a debate. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with debate, it's not generally what I'm interested in. So what I try to do on social media, sometimes certainly more successfully than others, is to push the thinking of others, especially on things that I find to be maybe a bit logically incoherent, in hopes of better understanding their thinking and or conveying what I think. I'm usually not trying to be snarky or trolling, but I'm pretty certain I'm not always perceived that way, and there are no doubt interactions from me where I've broken that rule, and I'm actively trying to be better about that. And social media, of course, doesn't make that easy, but I do hope that those with whom I disagree and perhaps may come off as particularly snarky to understand that I'm almost always happy to engage in a real-time discussion like I did with Lauren as I described earlier, either privately or publicly as a podcast, and that my interest in doing those kinds of things isn't to win an argument, but to better understand and be understood. Anyway, thank you for indulging my brief soapbox speech there, and now here's our salon conversation with Lauren, Jonathan, and Aaron. All right, I am with Lauren Brown, Jonathan Dallimore, and Aaron Aastor, and we're going to talk about how we should teach history and inquiry and memorizing and facts and knowledge and probably a whole lot more. I want to give each of them a little bit of an opportunity to give some background on who they are, what they do, that kind of thing, and then we'll kind of get into some of the meat of the discussion and see where it goes. So let's start with you, Lauren.
Hi, I'm Lauren Brown. I'm calling in from Chicago, Illinois. I've spent about 20 plus years in the classroom in high school, middle school, and at the college level teaching pre-service teachers how to become history teachers. And now I am writing on Substack and building up a practice to help train teachers and spread the word about how important history is at really all levels.
Okay, Jonathan?
I live in a town south of Sydney in Australia called Wollongong, and I was a teacher for a long time as well, and have now kind of switched into a role with our state-based History Teachers Association here in New South Wales. So that's a kind of like a curriculum role, if that might make sense to some of your readers, listeners, where we organise conferences and we publish a journal. We do a lot of advocacy for curriculum and things like that. And a lot of professional learning. And I do a little bit of pre-service teacher training on the side as well.
Okay, Aaron. And by the way, Jonathan was on the podcast earlier this year talking about his book, so we'll link to that in the show notes. But Aaron?
Hi, my name's Aaron Aastor. I'm a professor of American history here at Maryville College in Maryville, Tennessee, so East Tennessee, not far from Great Smoky Mountains and Knoxville. I have been here since 2007. We are a small liberal arts college that emphasizes teaching quite a bit, although I've certainly done quite a bit of research scholarship on 19th century America, sort of my specialty area in terms of research. I have long had an interest in different modes of pedagogy with respect to U.S. history at all levels. And in the past, I have helped with the advanced placement grading process. I've graded and did some work with that for several years. So I've got to see a little bit of how things are going at the high school level. In addition to, of course, having kids. I have 5 kids who have gone through the public school. So I see firsthand from that perspective what they're learning, what they're not learning, and how they're learning it, in addition to what students bring to the classroom here at college.
Gotcha. Well, I will have done some setup in the introduction, so we're not wasting our time on the genesis of this. One of the things that, and maybe a good way to start, is to kind of, in the context of like inquiry and knowledge and facts and memorization and all of those kinds of dynamics in teaching history and certainly other things as well. It's not just history, but we're all social studies teachers. I taught U.S. history and political science and government, those kinds of things at the high school level as well. Maybe Aaron, we can start with you. When I saw one of the things that you had posted, which was thought-provoking, one might say thought-stretching. I don't need to plug myself too much, but you had posted something about college students coming to you without a whole lot of requisite knowledge or things that you would anticipate. I don't think that's unique. I think we've seen that in from other folks in the university setting, and it's obviously a problem. And I think the way you framed it was something to the effect about the importance perhaps of memorizing states and capitals and things like that. So with that said, if you kind of like, how do you think about whether it's teaching history or teaching just in general, what are you seeing? What are the things that that you value, and how do you sort of think through some of those inquiry, knowledge, direct and explicit instruction, all those kinds of dynamics?
Yeah, sure. I think what set off that particular post, which went viral, which I was not expecting it to, was somebody, I don't even know who it was, had made a point about memorizing maps of some sort, and I said, yeah, we should we really need to go back to rote memorizing maps. I don't even know that I ever memorized maps, to be perfectly honest, when I was a student, but I know some classes have always done that. But it struck me that the frustration, as you just pointed out, of students who come to college and just seem to be lacking basic information about various things of not only of history and geography, but at the same time, and the reason I mentioned before about having kids in the schools, that I know they learn this stuff. I know this was not, everybody says, well, did they ever learn this? And the answer is yes, they did, but they forgot it all. And that's, I think, the thing we have to keep in mind here. It's not that they didn't learn it. It's they didn't really learn it. I mean, they learned it, they were exposed to it, they maybe did whatever they needed to do to get through the class, but something didn't stick. And that, I think, is the question we need to think about. Is Tennessee, like other states, has social studies standards. They're pretty decent. They were updated a few years ago. The one problem, we could talk about this later on, is Tennessee, like several other states, we don't, the high stakes testing program that we have is language arts and math and science, and social studies is left out of that, which is unfortunate. That may be a reason, I don't know, but that may be a reason why there's a little bit less emphasis on retention, but I don't even know if that's really it. For whatever it is, students I know they have, quote, learned this information before, but yet they come here. Beginning of this semester, for example, my early American history class, I was trying to talk about the transition from feudalism to, early modern development of capitalism. And very few even knew what feudalism was. They had a vague idea that it was something from the medieval age, and they didn't really, and I know they learned it. I know they learned it a few times, probably in 7th grade and then maybe in 10th grade again. I know where many of these students went to school, but it went in one ear and out the other. This is common. This has happened many, many times. The students who are really into it will retain it, but a lot of others won't. And what struck me is that when I think about this occurred to me as I was helping my daughter with math recently. She's in 5th grade, was doing long division. And I realized, there's been this discussion about phonics and the language arts thing, but I think there's a similar thing in math. About how learning long division, of course, in the process of doing that, you have to do all these calculations and you have to just know your times tables just automatically. Otherwise, it would take you forever to do this sort of thing. And thankfully, she did. The fact that she did have to memorize the times tables in 3rd grade. That helped her, okay, 8 times 7 is 56. And immediately you can, carry the number down and figure out the rest of it. And it struck me that she was able to do this complex stuff because she had that knowledge base and it had been drilled in and repeated. So that way she didn't have to think twice and go look it up or use a calculator or figure out what this basic building block of knowledge was in order to get to that next level. And I think a lot of times when we're dealing with acts of history, there's an analogous problem here where they don't understand. If I'm teaching about the American Civil War, for example, if they don't understand that Kentucky is north of Tennessee, okay, if they don't understand that Georgia is south of Tennessee, if they don't understand, just basic things like that, and they're from Tennessee, this is not like they're not from Australia. They don't have that excuse, they should know. But it's very hard to visualize a lot of things that are going on. If we're talking about, the military strategy of rivers and so on, if they don't have that drilled in it somehow, then it's going to be very hard to make any kind of sense of why people are behaving the way they are, why people are moving where they're moving in a time of war. And you can make the same thing about migration. You can make the same thing about all kinds of issues. And so there's something that was missing. I think it was not repeated enough, or it was, what do they call it? Pattern repetition, where you learn something and then you learn it again a little bit later, but sometimes in a slightly different format, and then again in a slightly different format. That was lacking, I think. And so a piece of knowledge went in one ear and out the other, and they never pieced anything together. And it was clear that I'm sitting there, I am essentially reinventing the wheel here, trying to teach them this basics, like here's the map, here's where everything is, and I sort of got to the point where I have to start every class with that. Here's where we are, here's Tennessee, and here's where all these things are in relation to us, and building out from there, because I can't assume that anybody has any knowledge of where these things are and when things happen, and so it is a constant reinventing, because I don't feel confident that any of it has stuck in the same way that the math instruction has stuck for my daughter. And she's an average, I guess, math student, but it has stuck because there was that repetition of that basic rudimentary, use the word facts there, that she was able to build upon and use them for a higher level of analysis.
Yeah. So the issue of cognitive load and working memory, and those things that surface, if you don't have that fluency and to be able to pull it from your working memory, having to get it from somewhere else, and of course that creates some cognitive load. So I'm sure we'll get into lots of that. So Jonathan, you might have a little bit different take and experience. So I'd like, when you think about how we should teach or teach history, how do you think about those relationships and those dynamics?
No, there's a lot to agree with there. Absolutely, for me. I mean, we have a similar problem in Australia in the sense that a continent, obviously, in the island is so big and complex. And so if you're teaching aspects of, say, the colonization of Australia, it's a complex story that involves multiple different terrains. And we just ran a conference a couple of weeks ago, and the historian who we had as our keynote was talking about the importance of place to understanding these unique features of the way colonization, which really worked itself out over 140 years over a hugely diverse terrain, had to be understood very much by place. And for a lot of students who haven't traveled to these places, it all needs to be kind of injected into the conversation at some point. That, you know, there were places where the colonial regime could use horses, you know, mounted police, and there were places where they couldn't. And so this changed the entire dynamic of how it worked between the First Nations people here and so on. So I think these sorts of things actually are really crucial. And I guess at this point, it's for me, this is where I'm often doing a lot of really concrete, you know, call it direct, explicit instruction, whatever you want, because I don't want to waste time on the students going off and researching and sort of thinking about the place, because I don't have time to do all of this. I'm going to sort of stand in front of a map and talk that through and give them a hook for this kind of place and space. Not just, you know, where are the towns and where are the cities and where are the rivers, but what does this actually mean? You know, and once the students can kind of, they can understand that, now we can go off and begin to explore the richer part of this conversation. Okay, so why did it work out like this? Now we're going to spend our mental load and our mental energy talking about this, because my class is a history class, it's not a geography class. So we're going to, you know, compress that geography bit, use that to our advantage, and then open up a richer conversation about this. So I totally agree. We have, and then, you know, if you want to put Australia in a bigger context, we have the Pacific to deal with, which is even worse in terms of, you know, remembering space and islands and nations and all of this sort of thing. So it's really complex. So yeah, I do think that's really crucial. If you've got no sense of space, it becomes a real challenge to even just read a text, watch a documentary and listen. You know, this is why documentaries often have these animated maps at the beginning, just to set the context, right? And then I guess the other thing is, when I think about teaching history, the more I'm sort of watching these debates, the more I'm trying to step back from them and look at history teaching from a broad perspective, where I think people get really tied up in knots over terms like explicit instruction and inquiry and all this sort of stuff. And I think they're often thinking, not all the time, but I think part of the challenge here is that we're often thinking on a small scale of teaching. It's like, what does this lesson look like? And this is probably even worse in a place like England, where they have inspections and they tick boxes and they watch, they say, what's in the, we don't have that, right? So I tend to think about teaching over a term and a year or a semester, right, as the kind of natural block of time for teaching history. And in that natural block of time, there will be moments where I'm standing in front of a map for 10 or 15 minutes and working through really concrete, fairly rote-learny looking things. And if you stepped into my class, you might think, oh my gosh, this is from the 1950s or something, you know? And then if you came back a week later, the students would be off in groups and doing something else with that information that's really rich and interesting. And, you know, over the course of a semester and a year, it would actually look like very different things, because I'm building intentionally into this natural block of time different modes of thinking and different modes of operating. And so for me, the more I kind of have these conversations about how to teach history, the more I want people to step back and say, ask the question, well, what are you doing in a lesson? I'm asking, what are you going to do over a term? And what are you then going to do over the next term? And then what are they going to be doing by the end of the year? So I'm really interested in this. And when I look at my own teaching, and I've never kind of, you can read my book if you want. I mean, I've never put it out there to say, this is how it works. This is what everyone should do. It's very personal. But when I step back and look at my own teaching, it's quite varied, actually. I think there are multiple modes in which I operate across time, depending on the class, depending on how quick they can move, and so on. So yeah, I think there are, within this, there's quite a wide bandwidth in my teaching, and there's some of it's that's very concrete, some of it is kind of dialogic, some of it's just quite open-ended, and this really depends on a whole range of different factors for me.
Okay, that's good. I guess context and background, Lauren. How should we teach history and all of those things?
So much to unpack from what you both said. So I'll start off just with Jonathan, since like you just spoke, but I love what you had to say about that, like, breadth of the whole semester. Like, I think we do very much need to care about what happens in a specific lesson.
Sure.
But you're so right that you have to add up all of those lessons, and it's the course of the year. And it always happens that your principal walks in right at that boring 1950s. And, you know, I don't really care if you want to call it explicit or direct instruction. I watched a video, you know, about explaining the differences. I think that's just getting too technical. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we're teaching kids to think. I mean, and that's what it's all about. And that we want kids to know what the world is like and how it works. And so speaking to, like, you know, Aaron, like what you had to say at the beginning, I wrote an article last year about why I had my 7th graders memorize the 50 states. And I did it because I was teaching a, you know, much more in-depth lesson about the Electoral College, and some kid like at the map I had that didn't have the names of the states labeled on it. They just had the numbers. And the kid's like, whoa, what's that state with 40 electoral votes? And he was pointing at Texas. And, you know, most of the rest of the kids in the class, they knew Texas, and some of them weren't very polite about it. Like, geez, like, how could you not know Texas?
Yeah.
Like most of the kids, they know Texas, they know Florida, they know California, and most of them know my own home state of Illinois. But I realized most of them don't know a lot more beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned a lot of interesting things when I did that. One of them is that it wasn't that hard for them to do. They kind of enjoyed it.
I agree.
I was surprised. I thought I would get pushback from parents about it. Like, how are you having 7th graders do that? But when I really think about it, I think they would have been a lot happier had their kids done it in 3rd grade. And I hadn't needed to like waste time in 7th grade doing that at all. So I'm really struck by, Aaron, what you had to say about your daughter, because it seems like one of the questions that we're asking ourselves is, you know, let's just assume I mean, I've talked to a lot of math teachers about this, like, do kids need to know their times tables? And the answer seems pretty clearly like, yeah, they do. And so I think the question that we're trying to wrestle with is, what is the equivalent in a history class?
Yeah,
exactly.
And clearly, like, knowing the 50 states, if you're a US history teacher, knowing the continents, knowing the oceans. I've had students who, when we were working on, you know, imperialism in the United States in the 1890s, and they were like, weren't sure which was the Atlantic Ocean and which was the Pacific. And it's like, oh my God. You know, and so another thing that I'm kind of struck by, Aaron, that I think that you're talking about is from the position of being a college instructor, you know, a university professor, is I think, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if there's times where you're like, what do they do in high school? And then the high school teacher's like, what are they doing in middle school? And I've been in middle, what are they doing in elementary school? And then we blame it all on the elementary school teachers, which is all. But I think what we're starting to understand from, you know, the science of reading and the, you know, viral podcast that Emily Hanford did, Sold a Story, is how very important background knowledge is to literacy. And so we do need to teach kids facts at a young age. Kids like doing that. I was volunteering in a 4th grade classroom last year while they were learning the capitals of all the states. And I would come in and they would rush to the door. Miss Brown, like, do you know what the capital is of Madison? And of course I used to live in Madison, so like that one I know. Like, they were really proud of themselves. And so it's not just a party trick. It's not just something that like can impress people at, you know, cocktail parties or pub quizzes or whatever you want to, you know, trivia contests. There are real reasons why you need to understand that. And to your point, Aaron, that like they learned it, but then what happened? They forgot it. The answer is they learned it only in their shorter term, like they didn't learn it permanently.
Right.
So they actually didn't learn it. And so what we have to do is find ways to build that knowledge systematically so that maybe in 2nd grade or 3rd grade, they're memorizing the 50 states, but then they learn about the capitals, and then they learn about regions, and they learn what these regions look like and what kind of crops grow in these places and the history about them and the regions, you know, and like, why is it that like when we talk about Arizona, we don't call Arizona as being part of the South, even though Arizona is South, right? When we're talking about the South, we're talking about the former Confederacy. And so the states have meanings, both individual meanings as the state themselves, but also as like a collective in terms of regions and systems of, you know, those states that are east of the Mississippi River, those that are the original 13 colonies, those that are, you know, west. So I think we need to think about not just having kids memorize facts for memorization's sake. It's so that we can gradually build that knowledge,
Mhm.
and that they don't need just like they don't need the calculator to do long division or to do, algebra. I saw there was a comment to your to the post that you made, Aaron, that someone's like, these kids are in 8th grade and they're doing algebra, but they don't like know what Ohio is. Like,
Yeah.
I think there's something to figuring out what are those facts that students need, and then why do they need to know them? So we're not just having kids memorize for memorization's sake.
The state capital one, that example, I think is really interesting. So I actually often reference that when I'm working with teachers in professional development settings. And when we talk about long-term memory and some of the dynamics at play there, it's a good example because almost everybody, at least at my age group, had to memorize states and capitals. And I don't know when that tailed off and where it tailed off, and maybe it's not tailed off. I don't know. I don't know that my daughter's ever had to memorize it. I'd be actually curious to know. But, Lauren, like what you're saying. So you say, well, they'll know if the adults in the room, these are teachers, they will know some states and capitals, but some they will just have wild guesses, be one person in the room who knows Bismarck, South Dakota, or something like that, right? But if they live in South Dakota, they would know it, right? Because they're thinking about it, they're using it. There's a reason for them to be using it, and I think that's, to me, one of the fundamental pieces. If you learn it and forget it, and I don't know, and maybe an offhand comment, but Lauren, you said they didn't permanently learn it. I don't know if I would say permanently learning it, or there's the learning curve and then there's a forgetting curve, right? We will forget basically everything. Some things will be burned in our memory because we've said our address from being a kid 100 million times or something like that, right? But if we don't use it, it is easier to forget. And so I think one of the fundamental questions is kind of what you alluded to there. I don't know anybody who's sensible who says we shouldn't memorize and have fluency on multiplication facts. Like, that is clearly something that you need to do basic math and do it without struggle, without cognitive overload and all those things. I'm willing to have a conversation whether states and capitals are one of those things. I don't know. I mean, the fact that a lot of people don't remember them means to me that it's probably not that important, but maybe there's a reason that they should. And so, like, what are the things that are important to your point, and for what, right? I saw a post today that was from Classical Education, and it was a really lovely poster that a kid had made, showing Lewis and Clark's trail and journey. And I thought, okay, so that they've made this poster ostensibly from memory, but then what and why? Like, why is that important? And why is it important that kids know, assuming it is, that adults know the path that Lewis and Clark took, and some of those dynamics? And is it better to, going back to the states and capitals, is it better to have them rote memorize those things, or is it to put it in context with other things? Like, so you mentioned South. I live in Kentucky. If you lived in, I grew up in the North, people up north in Michigan would say Kentucky's in the South. People in Mississippi would say Kentucky's not in the South.
Border state.
Right. Yeah. So when you start to give it other pieces of information to interact with, then it, to me, I think it becomes more likely that it'll be in long-term memory, easier retrieval cues, and all those kinds of things. So no question there.
Oh no, it's a good observation, actually, and I think this is a good context and to have this conversation, because we have 7 states. Like, there's no point. You know what I mean? Like, it's just not a. It's
so much easier.
Not a pressing issue in that regard, right? So I think that's actually a really telling point, because it doesn't mean that knowing these things is not important in Australia. It just means it has a different dynamic. And this is one of the things that I've noticed in the conversation as well, is increasingly as the conversations around education are global, I wonder, let's say I wonder, that's a better way to put this. I wonder if it's easier to have these conversations about maths and reading than it is about history. Because, and I think one of the challenges here is that I think the impulse has been in broad conversations. Again, this is a kind of a really general observation. There's been this kind of move to say, well, here's the science of reading. Here is the science of, whatever the next thing is. And there's this universal set of principles. And maybe it's easier to find those for something like reading than it is to actually say, here's what's essential knowledge for history. Because I live in Australia, you live in America. What if you live in Namibia? I don't know what the outlook on the world is from Namibia or Samoa in the Pacific, right? And I think those things are probably much more likely to be localized or need to be localized a little more than, say, reading. I wonder if that's part of the problem of the dynamic. We're always looking for the universal now to follow the lead of what's sort of maybe the work that's been done on phonics and reading, and we're trying to apply it to every subject. And I think it starts to break down a little bit. I wonder if that's the case anyway.
If I could jump in, I think one way to think about this, if you look at, I've looked at social studies standards, certainly in our state, probably others. You kind of every 3 years you keep coming back. The 4th grade, the 7th grade, the 10th or 8th grade, 10th grade, 5th, 8th, 11th. I guess I get them off now. The U.S. history, and each round through it is a little more sophistication. And sometimes it's helpful to sort of look long term to think, how might it be useful down the road to know this? I think one class I teach here at the college level is Appalachian history, which is not something that you would teach anywhere else in other parts of the country, other parts of the world. But there's actually a book about Chicago. And Lauren, maybe you know it, Nature's Metropolis by William Cronin. Wow. Yeah, I mean, that book. It's a wonderful book, and it actually, there's a historian here named Mark Banker who wrote a book that's kind of similarly themed about Knoxville, about East Tennessee. It was an environmental history. It's about the connection between the growth of a city like Chicago and how the timber and the feedlots and the corn, he basically, if you grow up in the Midwest and you read his beginning narrative about seeing cornfields and wheat fields, and then him telling you this is not actually natural, it's not prairie grass, and people are like, what? I always thought that was nature, and showing how artificially it was created, and then he goes from there to show how everything was reconfigured. Or the Peshtigo fire. I love that. It's the same day as the Chicago fire. More people died in this little lumber town in Wisconsin. What I loved about that book, and that book informs how I approach a lot of this stuff, is that you are talking about geography in a relational way. Okay. It is not so much that it's critical that they know that Bismarck is the capital of North Dakota or that Helena is the capital of Montana, but it is important to know, I think, at least in the context of here where I live, that, Chattanooga is where the Tennessee River winds its way before going from Tennessee towards Alabama, that it is a barrier going from Tennessee down towards Georgia, that the mountain range, that we're in a valley here, and you have a different kind of coal-based mountains to the west and the plateau and the ridge and valley to the east, and how settlers would have gone down a roadway that later on people have gone down that same roadway, and you can drive up Interstate 81 up to Pennsylvania, and you're following the same path that people have gone through hundreds of years before this, and you start to see how these are layering on. The lived experience is layered on. The relations of trade, the relations of agriculture, and it helps to understand Civil War loyalties, for example, in a place where I live, war was divided. It was a very, when you can get that, it's not just simply memorizing the map, although it does probably start with at least some rudimentary part, but it's then thinking ahead, how am I going to build off this? Why does it matter that, it was easier for someone to get to Virginia to Pennsylvania than it was to go right across to North Carolina? Something like that you would get almost a topographic map. Because it's relational. And I think that's what Cronin does with Chicago and the Midwest, and how everything is connected. And he shows the sinews of how things are connected. And that, I think, and what I often try to do is I try to connect it to where they're from. I always ask students the first day where they're from. And if I can, remember something, and I'll connect it to something, a hometown where somebody's from. And you sort of see themes of, say, the populist era, the Gilded Age, and you see three different iterations of, oh, there's a credit union, there's a co-op, there's a grain elevator, all of this right there. They're all products of 1880s agricultural financial, questions. And of course, this student has seen that every day of his life, but never thought about why this stuff is important. Yeah. Why is it there? And I think that it's getting them to start. That's the inquisitive question. Why is that there? What's it doing there? And how is it connected to anything else? But again, you have to know what else is out there beyond it in order to connect it to something. But you're doing both at the same time. It's relational, I think.
And I think you're right. It's how they build upon each other. And that's why I think, kids should be memorizing the 50 states in 7th grade. It's way too late. You do it early where it's just kind of fun for them. Right. And then you build on it. I would argue we probably don't need to do the capitals, but it's not a terrible thing to have students do. And I'm less like having that stick in long-term memory is less important to me. But, I was struck by what you said about Chattanooga and, William Cronin's book and how all those things, build on each other. And it connects to this larger issue of literacy. Mm-hmm. And so we want kids to have heard of things. Mm-hmm. We want them to have heard of the names of cities, of rivers, of states, because they're going to read books in English class, because they're going to read articles in the, online or nobody reads newspapers, but, they're going to read, articles in the news. And so it's part
See
of
it in their TikTok videos.
Exactly. And so it's building up that literacy. It's connecting it to like a deeper thing. Right. But maybe I can like pivot. So, because, I feel like we're going to get on and on with this like 50 state thing, which kind of leaves, our Australian out in the dust. So maybe we shift to like dates, because I was struck by something, Jonathan, that you said about, I think it was you that said it about, or maybe it was Aaron, about knowing when things happen. Mm-hmm. And so again, it's not just about memorizing dates. That's silly. It's understanding chronology. Yeah. It's understanding cause and effect. Yep. So if you have some kid who doesn't know, like, say, what came first, the Russian Revolution or World War I. Yep. Well, if you understand anything about the Russian Revolution, you know that World War I had to come first, because that's what destabilized the Russian regime. If you have a student who's like, oh, gee, I can't remember which came first, like the Mexican-American War or the Civil War. Yep. Well, you have a fundamental, like, there's
a Constitution and the Declaration of Independence.
There's a disconnect there, because it was the Mexican-American War that led to getting all this more territory, that led to the spread of slavery to the West, that caused the Civil War. So it's not about memorizing a bunch of events, about memorizing a bunch of dates, or even about memorizing things in order. It's about understanding the events so that no one would ever have to ask you which came first. It'd be the stupidest question.
So my kind of take on this, generally, and I'm sort of working through this, so this is provisional, but I actually think periodization is more important than chronology in one sense, right? And the two are obviously related. But what I find with particularly pre-service teaching, and I found this myself, is that I was getting tied up in my early days of teaching in like, okay, and the students would often say, what dates do I need to remember? And I was grappling with this for so long, and I was like, well, like you said, you clearly have to know the structure of these events to make sense of them and to say anything intelligent about them. You kind of have to get it. But so periodization, I think maybe the cognitive load people here would love me for saying this, but it's like the idea is I look at a timeline of events and I personally get overwhelmed. I'm like, there's 52 things here. I'm like, I'm never going to remember that. But if someone breaks it down and says there are 3 phases to this event that we can start, now that's all contestable. Let's circle back to that in 10 weeks and actually argue about this. Is a really interesting moment. Now we can actually break that down and say, well, here's an alternative one that breaks this down into 4 phases, not 3, because they argue that this was actually a turning point too. Now we've got a really rich discussion around chronology going on. But periodization, if I can get students to say Russian Revolution, there are really 3 big moments here. When we look at the Russian Revolution to World War II, we've got the Lenin period from 1917 to 24. We've got the power struggle that roughly overlaps this from 1922 to 1928, roughly. And then we've got the Stalin period from 1928 to 1941. I'm in business. And now I can break each of those down and start exploring. But I just keep coming back to the 3 big phases of the foundational period of the Soviet era. And we can we can look at each of these phases, we can get more particular, but if the students can remember that, they can start to say quite a lot. And so for me, I kind of have come to this view that I think periodization is a really powerful tool, not only because it's concrete, but also because it opens up later on. I think your point's really important. Later on, I can actually use that as a critical tool for thinking, is this a helpful periodization, or are there other alternatives that we could now work with? And ultimately, all periodizations are a form of interpretation, so I can take it in that direction. So it has, I feel like teaching is like this a little bit. It's like this, there are these things that I use that are often, I'm using them in a concrete periodization. I'm using it in a concrete way to begin with, and then I'm using it in a critical way later on. It's the same thing, but I'm opening it up and I'm expanding it into a more complex tool later on once the students are more confident and they understand a bit more about the topic and so on. So, I totally agree. I think, I actually have a problem in the sense that I don't really remember names and dates that well. It's like a weird thing as a history teacher to say that, right? But I don't think it's uncommon because they don't stick in my head. What sticks in my head are stories. And if someone says, on what date did World War I break out? I find it really hard. But if they say, tell me why World War I broke out, I'll probably put the date in there as I'm telling the story. Yeah. So I don't know what that is, but I think that's not uncommon either. So periodization, I think for me, is a really crucial tool in that regard. Yep.
So one of the things that Lauren and I talked about when we should have recorded our conversation was, I think, I'm going to describe this accurately, was sort of a couple things. One, which was the importance of building knowledge before doing critical thinking and the sort of order of operations. And again, Lauren, correct me if I'm misstating this, but something to the effect of that without knowledge, you can't do a whole lot of critical thinking, and that you should do that knowledge before going to inquiry. And some versions of that. Is that what, am I characterizing that right? Or
yeah, you can't critically think about nothing. You have to critically think about something.
Right. Yeah.
And so if you throw out a big question for kids, the only way they can answer like a really inquiry rich kind of question is the facts are the things that help them answer the question.
Right, which is where, so I agree. This is one of the points of disagreement where we landed and pushback. And so I think about critical thinking, and I think there's a distinction. It's not a hugely important piece, but I think it's imprecise to say that we can't do critical thinking without knowledge. We just can't do very good critical thinking without knowledge. Like I would characterize, analysis and things like that as some form of critical thinking. But clearly in our classrooms, we went good critical thinking, not surface level critical thinking. So, just that kind of as a side note. But one of the things that I advocate for, and I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with saying, okay, I'm going to teach this knowledge. If you think about Bloom's taxonomy, the understand and remember pieces, the content, saying, all right, I'm going to teach this stuff, and then I'll have them do some analysis or other, critical thinking's application, that kind of thing. But if we can frame that as a question and say, something like, who rank in order the top 5 most consequential presidents in U.S. history. And if kids have no idea about or little idea about the presidents, that, if I'm teaching it, would activate a process to say, okay, so what do we need to know? Well, we need to know who the presidents are, how we define consequential, what are their actions, all those kinds of things. And that's as an example, it's a big example, right? So maybe not the best example to give, because that would take a long time. You'd have to really do a lot of work, but perhaps, you can imagine it. And so for me, it's starting with that inquiry framing that then gives the opportunity for the teacher to model and to practice and say, all right, so what would we need to know in order to answer that question, and engage in some critical thinking, like, what do we mean by consequential? How do we define that? And then that learning that comes after that It might be explicit instruction. It might be, collaborative activities. It might be a variety of different things depending on how quickly, Jonathan, you mentioned like efficiency is important, right? We've got to move quickly. Sometimes we don't want to linger on things. So with all that said, like especially Aaron and Jonathan, of course, Lauren chime in, but we've kind of had some of this discussion about this. Is like, how do you think about the role of inquiry and knowledge building in that process?
I mean, I just throw in one idea here. I mean, as a general rule, I think it's 100% agreeable to me that students have to build knowledge to do anything interesting. That to me, I'm just like, I'm not really that fussed talking about an alternative to that, because what that opens up in history is just ridiculously opinionated post-truth nonsense, basically. So I think that's been one of the most damaging things about some sort of more technical sort of theories around usually linguistic and postmodern theories about history, is that it's opened up a little bit of a space where people feel like they can just kind of say anything and all facts are equal. And I think that's just actually nonsense. But anyway, so put that to one side. So I think it's crucial for history to have, I call it a factual architecture. If you're going to do anything, any topic needs a factual architecture that allows meaningful conversation. And that factual architecture will look different if you're teaching year 7 or year 12 or third year college students. It's just going to look different. It's going to look different in depth and complexity and all the rest of it. But it's the same principle at every stage. I guess what I would say, though, is that, and I don't want to open up a huge can of worms here, but it probably will. But it comes back to me to this question about what is critical thinking. And part of critical thinking in history is also teasing out assumptions. And impressions, because I agree, Aaron, that, lots of students don't come to necessarily history classes with a huge kind of depth of factual information necessarily. But I think actually in history, they often come with a lot of impressions about history as a subject, but also in terms of the topics we teach, like, when you're doing World War II, the students like have seen films and they've played video games. And so they come like, these are the bad guys and this is how it all works. Like, there are these impressions there that I want to kind of get a read on. And so sometimes before I do go, here's the facts and here's the story and here's the periodization and so on, I'll open up some questions about like World War II and say, like what's going on here, and let the students talk about it a little bit freely, and pose some big complicated questions. And the students may not have a lot of factual architecture at this point in time, but I want to tease these assumptions out. I want to hear some of the differences of opinion and actually use them to my advantage and say, actually, you guys are saying quite different things here. This is quite fascinating. This is often what history is about. So they're kind of interested, hopefully, in the topic. And now I can use this to my advantage, saying, let's all go on a journey together and see if there's some resolution we can bring here. So again, for me, it's that problem. If someone steps into my class at that point, at the beginning of a topic, and the students are sort of saying almost wild and varied things that are kind of uninformed, I might think, what are you doing? And I just say, hang on, give me a month and let's see where this circles back and comes back into the mix. And so it does sometimes look like inquiry in that open-ended form, and it may not. I haven't taught knowledge yet. And that's the point. I want to tease out assumptions and see where the pointy bits are in the class, and then use them to my advantage to take the class somewhere next. So again, it's that point, and I agree, Lauren, absolutely. Like, it matters what happens in a lesson, but it's this constant back and forth between the lesson and the long term that I'm interested in. It's a metaphor I often use about music. If you play music, it's like I've seen great music teachers pause like a saxophone player and say, they're sort of like improvising over jazz, and they say, why did you play G sharp there? And the student thinks, oh, I don't know, like, because it was the next sort of note that they're not going anywhere. But then they say, hang on a minute, I thought it was brilliant that you played a G sharp, because that leads into this resolution of the next thing. And that's going to open up this really great phrase that you could take in the next part of the chord progression. And so this particular note now has a huge meaning inside this song and inside the flow. That's how I think of a lesson now. It's like a note within an improvisation, So that would be my only kind of thing, is that there are definitely, for me, 100% agree, we need to build the factual architecture. There's no point teaching history without it. There's multiple ways of doing that in my head as well. But also there are moments where I might do things that look more technical and more open-ended and more critical, even before I've done any of that as well. And I think that's equally valid,
I think one of the fundamental critical questions in teaching and studying history is the so what question.
Mhm.
There is an endless amount of information that we could accumulate. And you're right, Jonathan. I mean, it's the dates, the chronology, it can get so technical and then we get lost in the weeds. We don't want to, it's, memorizing a trivia for its own sake is not the point.
Yeah.
But we have to ask ourselves, so what? Why do we care? Why should we care about this particular thing? And the answer is almost always going to be because it's connected to some other thing. And it's connected to some other thing that we think is important. I'll give you an example. This morning in my early U.S. history class, we talked about the Second Great Awakening, religious movement of the 1820s. And I was sort of giving them the shopkeeper's millennium Paul Johnson view of it connecting to the market revolution and the burned over district. And I was able to layer on all these different things about migration in the Erie Canal and eventually the development of Chicago. And, the whole movement of peoples across, in that case, upstate New York, but also different views about optimist Arminian theology and how, and sort of, but then sort of stepping back and saying, well, let's look at all these different religious groupings and why some people felt they were kind of stale. And I could connect it suddenly to where we're at, where I'm at Maryville College. We started as a Presbyterian college for Scots-Irish immigrants in the early 1800s. We were the second Presbyterian seminary after Princeton. The seminary didn't last very long because there were not enough college-educated people, and it was basically to serve. But the real question, and I said, okay, what are the church? We're in the Bible Belt. There's a ton of churches, but what kind of churches? Is everybody Presbyterian here? No, there's like 3 Presbyterian churches, but there's like 800 Baptist churches. So that raises the question: why are there so many Baptist churches?
Right.
And it gets to the structure. They're separate from each other, and it lent itself well to the rural landscape and so on. But it all came out of the weakness, chronological or periodologically, I guess that's really the word, of late 18th, early 19th century. People moved to the back country. There's not enough ministers for them, and so they drift away to their other denominations, and that creates the space, creates the moment for a religious revival, which is what the Great Awakening was. And connecting it to, and then of course the anxiety about control of the workforce and the liquor issues and all that stuff. Seeing how these things are connected, and some students are going to grab onto one thing. And some students are going to grab onto another thing, and another student's going to grab onto a third thing, and maybe connect 2 or 3 or 4 of these things around. And what I'm trying to do is trying to create as many connections as possible. And I also assess them on this. I give my exams, I give them a study guide with a list of terms, and I said that I will pair up 12 of those terms into 6 pairs, and you get to choose like 2 or 3 of the pairs, and you have to write down like an identification, but it's an ID pair. So you have to do the who, what, when, where significance of the first term and of the second term, and then the historically significant connection between them. So I say, as you study these terms, think how are they connected to something else on that list? And so they're already thinking synthetically. They're thinking about connections. And that is where it becomes meaningful. So it's not just, it could be a seeming esoterica. It can seem like it's a random piece of trivia, but really it's indicative of some bigger force. And if that's where they can connect, not only do they know that piece of information, but then the next time they come across something in the world, they can now know, oh, I wonder how that's connected to this other thing that's going on. And bam, that's the critical thinking piece that they are now activating in their own.
That sounds awesome. I want to do that exam.
I love that. That's so funny, Aaron. I mean, that's exactly like the kind of test that I give, like both when I taught high school and middle school, is identifying something, explaining the who, what, when, where, why it's historically significant, and in doing that, you have to connect it to these other things. It's those connections that make the difference.
Give it its meaning,
and it's the connections that also help us better understand the world we live in today.
Right. Yeah.
And I feel like the deeper my understanding is of history, the better I understand my present moment.
Yes.
What's going on in the world today.
Absolutely.
And I think, Jonathan, you're right to ask the question, what is it that we want our kids? I mean, you were both asking it, what do we really want them to know? Why do we have to know this stuff?
Yeah.
And that is the most important question our students ask. And they ask it every day. They ask it in math class. They ask it in science class. They ask it, why do we have to know this stuff? Why do
you ask it? It's a good question to ask.
It's a great question. And we as the teachers need to know the answer to it. Mm-hmm. The answer might be, well, okay, maybe you don't really need to know about the Second Great Awakening, but what the Great Awakening will help us understand is all of these other things. Yeah. And, if we want to throw out, Mark Twain's like quip that, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, then it helps us to understand the present moment. And I would also argue, even like bigger than that, I always tell my students on the first day of class, like, full disclosure, I know adults that don't know the answers to questions that I'm going to ask you guys on tests. There's plenty of successful people I know that really don't know that much about history.
Yeah.
Yet they've like survived. So I always have to ask myself the deeper question of like, why do we have to know this stuff? And the answer is maybe like you don't, in terms of being able to like, make a good living or, whatever, and I know a lot about American history, but I don't know a hell of a lot about Australian history. And I don't know a whole lot about physics.
You're doing fine. Yeah.
Other topics that other teachers out there would say, you got to know physics.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I come back to like a fundamental like issue. It's, it's Socrates. It's the unexamined life is not worth living. And it makes life richer to know more things.
I totally agree with that. And I think there's just people go, why do you need to know about the Russian Revolution? I'm like, why wouldn't you want to know about it? It's just fascinating in and of itself, regardless of whether you get to talk to someone at a party, regardless of whether it gets you a job. It's in fact,
there's a war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine that is connected to all that.
That's going on right now.
Yeah. And one there's 2 points there that I think I want to pick up on. And one is that I actually do think this is where I personally think there are limits to knowledge and the importance of knowledge, where, I know this is a sort of, the E.D. Hirsch argument is that, there's this certain kinds of knowledge that will allow you to flourish in the world. I mean, in Australia, I'm not sure what it's like in America, but you're more likely to get a job knowing the football results over the weekend than being able to quote Shakespeare. I mean, I just think there are huge limitations to that argument myself. And I mean, there are all sorts of other things we could raise about the sort of the history that he put into his books that I think is all kinds of questionable. But I'm not saying that knowledge doesn't matter. I think it does. I just think it's often overstated. And so the question becomes, I think this is where that question for me becomes really important, is, well, what else could a student take from my class that could actually be useful? I think knowledge is part of it, sure. Like, for me, it's just helpful to know that World War I, roughly between 1914, 18, the Russian Revolution, 19, these things are actually just useful. I don't want to Google everything. It's a waste of my time. So knowing things does actually help in a lot of ways, but there are limits to that as well. But what else could a student take away from this? Second Great Awakening is a great example. I don't know heaps about the dynamics of that, but what I would be hoping that my students also get exposed to in that process is an experience of understanding that these events are interconnected, and they can do that in multiple different ways. My ancestors came out to Australia fairly early in the colonial period as convicts of the British. They were Irish Catholics, and I tell the students they came here because of Napoleon, and they look at me like, what are you talking about? And I say, well, Napoleon was kind of, flirting with nationalist movements in different part of the world, and then the British basically went through Ireland and rounded up a whole bunch of people who were connected to the Republican Brotherhood. And my ancestor went to court and said he was part of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and got sent out here. This is a big wave of crackdown on the Republican movement in Ireland.
1798, right?
Yeah. So this is exactly early 1800s. They get sent out here, and so my family connection. This is an experience of family history being connected to global events, and they kind of, I think, some students, not all of them, kind of go, "That's interesting. I wonder if my family history is connected to these big global events." So it's these multiple exposures as well to the fact that all of these things around us are connected to all of these different things. And when I want them to think as a result of this is the concrete takeaway. Whenever someone comes to you with a simple story about history and says, this is why this happened, and it's a monocausal argument about why this broke out and it's all their fault, I want you to say, maybe, what other alternatives are there? And if they've been exposed to that 50 times in their education, the likelihood is that their impulse is not to jump on bandwagons, but to actually slow down and say, it's possible. That's a really interesting story. Thanks for that. I'll go away and think about what else might be true here. And that's an enriching experience in and of itself. So there's something for me, I guess, to put it really concretely, there's something for me, facts and information and stuff knowledge is really important, but there's something bigger than that too. And I think it's possible to encourage at least students to think in those ways. And I think that's part of what a history education is really about too.
So one of the quotes that I really love, if you're familiar with Grant Wiggins, he passed away several years ago, but UBD, Universal Basic Design, backwards planning. And sometimes I'll use this in our workshops to sort of get a sense of what teachers are valuing, because you do a lot of project-based learning inquiry work. And let's literally think about, how do we suss out, like, how do they value knowledge? And the quote is, knowledge is an indicator of educational success, not the aim. And I think that is kind of what we're talking about here, right? Like I mean, in some sense, I think, like, I'm probably a little bit more resonant in supportive of E.D. Hirsch's, at least the idea of a shared cultural knowledge, so that we can talk, and there's some norms and things like that. But what's the extent of that, right? But that knowledge in and of itself has some value, but it's like, what can you do with it, right? What are your thinking? How well can you think about it? How can you make those connections and use it in ways that are useful, whether it's in a job or conversations or whatever it might be? But I want to pick up on something that's kind of come up a couple times, and this is one of the things that I really think is important. One of the reasons, again, why I think inquiry is so important is, you mentioned sort of different perspectives and postmodernism, and people coming with different ideas and say, this is my lived experience, this is my truth. And I think we've lost, my argument is that over decades now, we have not done a good job of teaching in K-12, at least, of basically Enlightenment liberal principles, and what truth is, and that, to me, that's fundamentally an inquiry project. And so one of the things I think we need to do a better job of, and as social studies history teachers, I think that's obviously a perfect place to do it. It's not the only place, but to be able to sort of enculturate that mindset of, like, is that true? How is that true? In what ways might it be true? Right? Is that a perspective, or is that something that we've come to as a sort of set of knowledge that's always provisional? I love Jonathan Rauch's work, Constitution of Knowledge, and Kindly Inquisitors, and that process. And to me, that inquiry process is super, super important. Here in the States, we have, some of you may have heard, some culture wars about teaching of history. And, now we're on the pendulum swung back the other way, right? I think there's a colorable argument that, Howard Zinn kind of American history is perhaps a bit lopsided. And as history teachers, we want to be able to say, so here's how some people think about it. Here's how some people think about it, right? But there are sets of facts, right? This many people died at this battle, or this happened at this date. Like, those things we don't want to have up for question. But really enculturating that process, and Lauren, I know you use lots of inquiry, we talked about this before, is like the order of operations and where you put it might be a little bit different. And I don't think there's anything wrong with doing inquiry after you've built knowledge, but that sense of, again, enculturating, and as a side note, when you frame a set of coming knowledge and facts and things that you're going to teach with a big inquiry question, I think it creates a sort of mental model, a framework, a visual for people to then say, okay, now that I'm going from the macro to the micro, I have hooks to hang it on, right? Because I've thought about this as a big question. And I think that's one of the values in starting with a big inquiry question before they even know anything.
Yeah.
Well, and that's where we totally agree, Drew, is that having that big question, I don't think you can have inquiry without knowledge. I don't think you can have truth without knowledge. I think we need knowledge to understand, and knowledge to have wisdom, and knowledge to understand what's truth. But I do think that having that big guiding question, and I don't care if you want to call it an enduring understanding or an essential question or just a big question or important question, but something that is, that answer to, like, why do we have to know this? Well, we have to do this because it helps us wrestle with this big question. And I find often that the very big questions are the ones that maybe there isn't an answer.
Yeah.
The big question I always had for my unit on, like, industrial America was, like, to what extent is laissez-faire capitalism compatible with liberty and equality?
Right.
It's not like that's
But
a
that's
really
important, isn't it? But this is part of again, I just bring it up because it's topical, but and we've been talking about it, but the here again for me are the limits of the cultural knowledge argument is that, if cultural knowledge is just, information and an idea of Shakespeare and these events in world history and these poems and whatever that else it may be, I think that's just really limited. I mean, cultural knowledge, in my view, would be about what you're talking about, Drew, as well, which is how to have arguments. That should be cultural knowledge. Right. It should be what Lauren's talking about, which is there are questions you probably won't get an answer to, and you'll have to keep revisiting for the rest of your life. That should be as readily brought up in my long-term memory and in my experience as Shakespeare wrote The Tempest. And other things to be
fair to E.D. Hirsch, I think he's widely misunderstood just
Sure.
based on that first book. He admitted it was a little too Western and a little too old-fashioned, but I think his premise of one, shared culture, cultural knowledge, but his basic thing is that we have to know stuff.
And I'm cool with that. I'm cool with that. And that's, I think that's kind of my argument here is that let's build knowledge, but it's going to be diverse. That's the ultimate reality. And I think Aaron's point before is a really great example of this. And I think, again, this is a part of the uniqueness of history as a subject. And it's not completely unique. I think other subjects have similarities here, but this idea, so I'll just, describe my reaction to maths class and history class as a student. And my reaction to maths class was pretty closed. I was like, there's a sort of, they're teaching me an algorithm. I just have to learn how this works and then I give it back to them and that's cool and I'll get through it. And I did that and I went relatively okay. But I wasn't thinking, what are the interconnections between, algebra and all of these other mathematical, but when I was in history class, they were like, hey, the Roman Empire. I'm like, hang on a minute, that wasn't that at the same time as this other thing over here? And I'm putting my hand up and I'm asking questions about, it was an expansive subject to me, history, which is part of why I liked it, rather than something where I just went, here are the lanes, I'll figure it out, I'll get through the subject and off I go. I just, and you could use the Second Great Awakening as your text or the book that I don't know the book that you talked about, but let's say you've read that and you've got this really rich way to teach this topic through that lens of that scholar. And I teach the same material through the lens of another scholar, it's going to have that rich diversity, right? So I think that's history in a nutshell, is that I actually don't think we'll get to a point, even in a country like Australia, where we all agree this is the cultural shared knowledge that we should have. There'll be some overlaps, there'll be a Venn diagram, there'll be some rough overlaps, but we shouldn't be trying to squeeze these circles into this tight, fully agreed thing. We just have to accept that it's fractal. History is fractal. It's going to explode in all different colors and shapes. So yeah, I mean, again, it's not an argument against E.D. Hirsch. It's saying, I just think for me, I'm like, yep. And then what else? There's so much else we've got to talk about here. That's how I sort of see it.
One thing I would add to that, I think it's a great point about being fractal, is that, for most of us, when we grew up at a time when there was, for lack of a better term, an answer key to things. You could look it up and you could find what was definitively the case. In the social media era, the YouTube era, the last 15 years, really, so you can go before this sort of social media, there has been such on one level, you can see a democratization of knowledge, or you can see an anarchy of takes, information. And students are constantly checking these things. And algorithms, of course, sometimes are driving them to extremist stuff, and sometimes they're driving to conspiracy, just weirdness, and but what it has destabilized, if you think of the E.D. Hirsch thing and the fractal nature of it has almost infinitely, fractured even more. And it makes it harder sometimes, I think, to reconstruct it, because you can't say at the end of the day, okay, that's all fun and games to talk about, the Masonic conspiracies, but this is really what happened. It's harder to do that. It's harder to sort of lean on and say, well, this is the truth of how it is. And yet at the same time, we know that it's important that we separate fact from fiction, so to speak. And I don't think any of us are extreme Foucauldian linguistic current. So we all agree that there is a reality there. It's not just all discourse. But at the same time, proving the discourse. It's like catching someone using AI, using ChatGPT. It's like, I know you had a machine do this, but how do I prove it? Because the thing creates it all the time, which of course is another whole dimension here, right? I mean, who's even putting this stuff together. But that, I think, is the biggest challenge now, is that we can talk about the importance of facts and of connecting facts and of asking the bigger questions, but it's also the fact that it's also the case that the underlying architecture of information is so in flux and is so destabilized that it can be, and students are relying more on algorithms in order to do a lot of that spade work, that when it's wrong, then the thing they produce is wrong. And then it creates a cascade of wrongness that just keeps going. And it can be very difficult to undo that. And AI is going to accelerate that so much worse. I mean, forget the whole, the cheating and stuff. It's that it brings wrong information and accelerates the usage of it, the dynamism of it. I feel like it's 1919, and I'm Henry Adams with the dynamo. But it isn't kind of that way. It's almost nauseating in a way. But it's also, you sort of stop and say, okay, wait a minute. No, there is a reality here. Okay. These are things that really happen. And we can stop with the basic question of what really matters. How does it connect to our lived experience? How does it connect to things that we know about how the world works and should work and should not work? Basic values questions. I think we can come back to these fundamentals. We're still human beings. We still live in societies that are, that we have to connect with each other, even if the technology is so different. And so it's easy to get nauseated by all that. And it happens to me probably every week, where I'm getting into something and I'm thinking, their minds are so off somewhere, some meme somewhere, and they're talking about Ohio and not even meaning the state and meaning some meaning of it. But it's at the same time, it can ground you though. And that, I think, is ultimately the value of it, is that you can explore these other questions, but you can also pull back and say, here's the reality around you. Okay, look at the place around you. Look at how they connect things that matter to you and connect them out. And you can start to discern. You can discern between junk, and there's so much junk out there, the signal and the noise. I mean, you can discern from that. And that, I think, is the critical thinking value, is knowing what matters and knowing why it matters.
One of the
Go ahead, Jonathan.
I was just going to say, one of the things that I would add to the importance of, knowledge is I think there's a huge question around what kinds of knowledge matter. And one of the kinds of knowledge that matters is the let's just call it the informational type of knowledge, which is World War I, 1914, 18, that stuff that gives us, a starting point. That's really important. But for me, when it comes to history, the other thing that I actually think is really crucial is, and again, this would depend on the age of the students and so on, but some understanding of the big debates that have gone on with these things, right? So so again, let's take World War I as an example. There is a huge debate over whether World War I was sort of necessary, quote unquote, right? That's a huge part of the debate. Was it just a colossal waste of life, or did it stop the German Empire from sort of running over Central Europe and wrecking Europe for the time being, right? That's the basic sort of argument there. Now, so I'm not gonna throw that question at students, to what extent was World War I, a valid war, or whatever you want to call it, a just war, and then just give them an completely open-ended thing. I'm going to actually say to them, here's the question. Here are two of the towering scholars that have been involved in this. And now I'm going to help you understand their arguments, and I'm going to ask you to locate yourself inside this conversation a little bit. I'm not asking you an infinite horizon here to come up with a unique interpretation of World War I. Cultural knowledge, for me, really powerful, actually, cultural knowledge is to go, the student knows 1914 to 18. There's this big question about whether World War I was even necessary, and there are a few big schools of thought. Basically, anything they come across on TikTok or any other things is probably going to feed back to that big river at some point.
Yeah.
And so I think historiography, let's call it that, which is, I'm just meaning here interpretations, is part of, I think, rich cultural knowledge. And it's often left out of the picture when people talk about the importance of knowledge. They talk about concrete things. I agree, that's important. I would actually add to the mix here and say I think they also need to be exposed to multiple interpretations, and that's actually a form of cultural knowledge.
Yeah, well, that is what history is. It is interpretation. It's facts plus interpretation. And so knowing like those major schools of thought, I think, are so important. I'm just laughing because, we've been talking for a long time, and I was wondering if in the course of an hour we were going to get to AI and social media and TikTok, and congratulations, like Aaron, you brought us there. So
finally,
I mean, all of these things raise, I think, these very big questions about education in general. So
yeah. And Aaron, so you talked about, you used the word reality several times, and again, I'll go back to the Enlightenment pieces and Jonathan Marsh's work and the idea of a reality-based community and the practices. If we're going to talk about the shared cultural knowledge, I think Jonathan, you kind of hit on it's not knowledge in terms of knowing what happened when necessarily, although it's part of it, but how do we figure out what's true, and how do we discern what's not true, and understand what's perspective and interpretations and those kinds of things. We've got a president who recently said that Ronald Reagan's speech about tariffs was made up by AI. He's creating his own reality. We've got people who are saying that, Winston Churchill was the bad guy and Adolf Hitler probably did the Jews a favor because they just didn't have enough food to feed them. So, why not just exterminate them? These versions of things, right? It's just bonkers and bizarre. So leaning into those reality-based community practices, I think is just, it's not just history and social studies teachers, but I think we're uniquely poised to do that, right? Because we have great examples to look back and say what happened and why did it happen? How do people interpret it? What are the perspectives? One of the things that that frustrate me in this sort of debate, this argument, not the one we're having, but the larger one is what I find is a sort of rigidity and narrowness on either end, whether it's a sort of progressive constructivist side where people will say, oh, kids don't need to know stuff. They don't need to know facts or things. They can just look it up. And I'm like, no. Yeah. Yes, they can, but that's going to there's an opportunity cost there, and it's often a huge opportunity cost, right? But then on the other end, there's just sort of a overt focus on like knowledge, like remembering things almost for remembering things' sake, and memorizing poems and things, which isn't void of value totally, but like if I'm going to spend my time doing something, it's not going to be memorizing poems. Again, because I have a limited amount of time, and I also have no interest in memorizing poems. But so how do we sort of brook that gap? And I don't know that any of you have the answers to it, but like that's sort of my mission, is like, how do we acknowledge that knowledge is important, but also acknowledge that there are multiple ways to and things and nuances and complexities of making meaning and making distinctions and all of those kinds of things, so that we don't have people. I saw somebody the other day, I posted on LinkedIn, so you can't be curious about things if you have no knowledge or something like that. I was like, of course you can be curious about something. If you didn't know anything about it, you'd probably look at it and go, what the hell is that? Like, that's curiosity. And then you start digging and that kind of thing. So again, not really a question there, but just like that bridging of like, not either or, but like, let's break out of this rigidity and narrowness and saying, well, it has to be this or it has to be that. And it just drives me crazy.
It drives me crazy too. You bridge the gap because both extremes, often things at the extremes aren't accurate. And right. I think that's the best lesson that we can teach our students too, whether we're talking about, politics or things that happen in history or how we teach history. Mm-hmm. You have to combine those approaches, That at the end of the day, we're obviously not just trying to teach kids a bunch of facts. That's silly. Yeah. Them a bunch of facts so that they can ask real questions about the world and their place in it.
Yeah.
For me, what I sort of, if I'm asked this, by younger teachers who are confronting this stuff, my advice is, well, look, this is just how I approach it, right? Again, I'm not telling you how to do this. I don't have the science of teaching history. I'm happy to admit that. I don't think that's a problem. I think I'm relatively successful in my job. So I'm never gonna say to you, this is how it has to be done. I'm going to say, this is how I approach it, and you can take it or leave it as you wish. I think there's a little bit too much, telling other teachers how they have to do things all the time going on at the moment. I think that's been a little bit unhelpful, and people have got their back up over it. So I've tried to take the opposite approach here. But my kind of general reaction to some of these things is, well, firstly, I'm not interested in actually adopting. I often say I'm not interested in buying a jersey for education. The progressive one or the whatever one or whatever it is. I'm not actually. It's not a reaction. I'm just actually uninterested in that. So it's okay. What I am interested in is actually asking, how do I teach history? Because that's my subject. I love it.
Yeah.
And that's a complicated set of questions. And it's not about teams. It's about like, well, again, what am I going to do in this lesson, and then over this week, and then over the month, and over the term, and over the year? That's what I'm interested in. And then I guess the second point that I kind of, this is the more cynical side of it for me. I guess I'm in my 40s now, so I'm allowed to do this, and that is, education is full of marketing, right? It's just more than when I started. It's social media. Like, when I started, there was basically no social media. It's just everywhere now. And you open up an app and it's just marketing from schools and universities and individuals who are trying to climb the ladder and sell their books, like me, like I'm part of them too. Like we're all sucked into this huge commercial enterprise now that is education, that's just rapidly become, I think, more commercial than it's ever been. And so people are going to try and sell things by saying that bad, this is good, and I actually think it's, again, the historian's kind of instinct, hopefully, to step back from this and say, why are they saying that? What's their interest in trying to sell me this thing? Great. I'm glad that your career's taken off because you've become a real advocate and you bought the jersey for whatever thing. That's excellent, but it doesn't mean I have to listen to you. It doesn't mean I have to agree with you. So I tell young teachers, often I'm like, just get into the system, take your time, don't buy the jersey, you might one day, that's fine, go for it, but don't do it in year 1 or year 2 or even year 10. Like, I still haven't bought a jersey. I'm 20 something years in. So just take it easy, slow down. And there's a lot of people trying to sell you things. I also think that's an important reminder.
I have a thought that of something that I've never really, maybe there are people who write about this, I don't know. But one of them that has always struck me is we don't really think about, or often enough, about how the age of the student matters in terms of how they orient themselves to what's being taught. And what I mean by that, I don't mean that just in terms of development of their knowledge base. I mean their maturity.
Yep. Young
kids, there seems to be an arc here. Young kids in elementary school, there's a period where they love history, and when you dig into it, it's fantasy. Okay, they're fantasizing, they're imagining they're in this medieval period, they're imagining they're in this war, they're imagining they're later on in life. I give a lot of public lectures about local history and stuff, and there's always people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who show up in these things, and they love to, because they're thinking about it. And what it comes through is that they've seen history happen in the course of their own lives, and they want to know what the bigger context is, and so they appreciate them doing that. Then there's the people that I have in my classroom, who are the young adults, and who are thinking very short term about their world, and high school kids the same, and don't have a whole lot of perspective because they haven't lived very long. But they also are too cool, too mature to be thinking the fantasy. I imagine if I was a Teutonic Knight, what it would be like in East Prussia. I mean, they don't go through that doesn't go through their minds. So it's a harder thing to reach those people because they get a little cynical, they get a little bit more. So you have to approach how maybe it's let's dispel this myth, or this is what they say. But sometimes you watch the better sort of history YouTubes, for example, and how they approach this, and the sort of this is the prevailing myth. That's a myth breaking thing, and that's you get to their skeptical nature of high school. But I don't know. I'm just sort of, my experience of this is that the age and maturity level of the actual audience, whether it's in a classroom or out in public, is something that I think we who are history educators really need to think more about, because how people orient to it is often affected, especially if you're speaking to people of multiple ages. They just have these different mental makeups or emotional mental makeups as they come across this knowledge. Are they thinking, oh, that could have been me? Oh, that was me? Oh, that was my grandparents? Oh, that was, I could imagine, I think that we forget that a lot. We're thinking about this is a discrete abstract thing, and there's something about the psychology of where they are in their development, their personal development, that I think we need to think about more.
Yeah, I think there's a piece of it, and I know we probably need to start thinking about wrapping up, but there's a piece of it. I was doing some giving some feedback on a book by his name's Christian Moore Anderson. He's got a book coming out on making meaning. And he mentioned first order and second order reality, and I think that's kind of relevant here. And you can have a first order reality of like, this is what happened, right? A teacher could tell you, and this is what happened. But that second order reality, in some sense, is like, how do we make meaning of it? And little kids might be, fantasizing about it, whereas older people are thinking about, how does
Analyzing it and
different context, that kind of thing. And that making meaning part is such a big piece of it's why knowledge is important, but it's not the only thing. It's like, that's not the goal. It's to be able to make meaning and to be able to think about those things. So I do want to wrap us up. Any parting thoughts? So we can go around the horn, Lauren, Jonathan, Aaron, and then we'll get out of here to our respective continents and places.
I'll wrap it up by just piggybacking on, Aaron, what you said about like at different ages. I mean, I think at the heart of what you're saying is that history speaks to little kids because it's a story, and it speaks to older adults who have that perspective. And so what we need to do as history teachers of people in those like middle years, in the, college, high school and middle school years, is somehow get back to that story and meaning making that the older generation brings to it. And if we can do that for our students, tell the story, but make those connections and do that analysis, I think we're gold.
My little wrap up is I'm not gonna quote but paraphrase the 14th century Muslim scholar Ibn Khaldun, who said in his book of the history of the world, he said that all people love history, he says, which I think is absolutely fascinating. 600 years ago, completely different part of the world, and he says people are just ensconced in history, right? And there are three things they like about it, depending on who they are. They like the story, they like the how and why, the analysis, they like to debate these things, and then they like the philosophy of it. What can it teach me? Is there wisdom in this? And I actually think those three things are pretty, I'm not going to call anything universal, but it's pretty close. Like, I meet people who love the stories of history. I think we should really exploit that. We should exploit the analytical stuff, and we should exploit the philosophical side of it. And all of these things move and shift depending on our audience, right?
Yeah. Aaron?
I guess my last thing is that I will know that I've done my job when my students come out of my classes and they are thinking historically. That's what I want them to do. I want them to think historically. I want them to think historically about their own worlds, their own times, about things that are around them, to ask why they're there, how they got there, why it matters. They have to build on scaffold on other knowledge and other modes of inquiry, but it's to inculcate this desire to want to know, to think historically. That's ultimately what I think we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I'll use that as a bit of a springboard to wrap us up. And it's thinking historically, or thinking like a historian. And I think the key word there is thinking. Your jobs are to teach history, so it makes sense that you want them to think historically. An economist would want them to think as an economic scholar or something like that, scientist, and so on. But the thinking is a really important piece. And when we get into the sort of science of learning debates of cognitive science, and again, a lot of it I think is really, really important. We want to take those lessons to heart, but there's also we should be paying attention to the science of thinking, right? That how do we get them to think? Learning and knowledge are all parts of those pieces, but we ultimately want them to think. Explicit teaching is a big part of it, but explicit learning is, I think, really important. So that complexity and nuance, which is just obviously absolutely vital. So I want to thank all of you for joining, and appreciate the conversation. Any of you want to share places? Jonathan, you've got to sell your book at some point. Before we jump off here, Lauren, any places you want to share?
I'm on Substack, Lauren Brown on Education.
Okay, Jonathan.
No, I'm okay. You put the book in the show notes. I really appreciate it, and thank you.
All right. Yeah, and I'll link to our previous podcast conversation about that book. Aaron,
I posted almost my public engagements are mostly on Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it now. I have a Substack, but I don't use it. I do have prior books about Kentucky, Missouri, actually during the Civil War, called Rebels on the Border. Also one of the Civil War along Tennessee's Cumberland Plateau. I did a historiography of slavery, American slavery. Came out a few years ago. I'm working on a book right now on the election of 1860 as a grassroots phenomena from the perspective of 4 different communities. So I'm definitely engaged out there publicly, but I pretty much everything I do, I put out there on Twitter, even though I use it for as my multi-use social media.
You have a page on your university. Does that, because that's how I found your email address, but does that have your publications and links there?
Yeah, that has, I think, a link to my latest CV. So I have, but I usually sort of advertise it, somewhere on Twitter. Yeah. I never really know exactly, because there's all these different, LinkedIn and everything, and then it just seems to go nowhere. But it seems to have the most reach doing on Twitter for whatever reason. Yeah.
Well, again, thank you all. I really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.